So let me just explain why we're doing this stream. On last week's Cigar stream, I talked about the book I've just finished writing, which is called "The Prophets of Doom." And as I talked about last week, in that book, I cover 11 writers who have had cyclical theories or theories of rise and fall of history, from Vico in 1725 all the way to Peter Turchin, who's still alive, who uses mathematical modeling, kind of a reign of quantity approach. And along the way, I obviously deal with Spengler and Toynbee and people like John Bagot Glubb. And one of the people who has a chapter is Julius Evola. Now, I don't know. I thought I knew Evola. I'd run a Evola Day. I've had several streams with UCAT. But I don't know, if you're anything like me, you never truly get to know somebody's thought properly until you work on them. Until I wrote a chapter, researched it inside out, really started thinking what is he talking about here? Going back through Revolt with a fine tooth comb and trying to, because when you write on someone, you have to be able to explain it to other people, and in order to explain it to other people, you have to get it right in your own head. And I assume you've gone through something like this, making your amazing Revolt Against the Modern World series, Kat, where you think you know him, but in order to get it right for the audience, you really have to think do I really understand this? Have you had the same sort of experience?
Oh, yes, definitely. And I continue to do so. Upon every new reading, I feel like, oh, I wish I'd included that in the episode on this chapter, or, just coming to a deeper understanding that, I wouldn't have had, a few months or a year before. So it's a constant process, and it's with me doing my Revolt series, looking back on some of the earliest episodes, I'm just if I could do them again today, I would do them so differently. But, that's just how it goes. It's no matter how much you already know, no matter how much you can teach other people or write in a book, there's still so much more to know. So, but we will do our best to get to the bottom of some of this stuff today, or at least deepen our understanding in preparation for the next step.
Yeah. So one of the things I had not quite appreciated about Evola until I wrote this chapter was that I always had this idea, right? Okay, Guénon was his master, but they had some disagreements. Evola didn't believe the Brahmin caste could rule in the West. He had this idea of regality in the figure of the emperor type thing. But yada yada. I kind of had that kind of layman's understanding. I knew there was this difference between them. But going back over Revolt this time, it really struck me that the change from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, right, as Evola describes it, from the I guess the solar masculine vitality of the Golden Age, as he describes it, which is this vision of regality where you have almost a kind of warrior king who embodies the kind of spiritual energy in himself as well. It's like he's a kind of warrior and priest in one, right? Correct. As this kind of monarch or emperor figure. Okay. And then you see, I had always had in my mind something in the Golden Age, it's the priests who are on top, and then it degradates to silver, and then it goes down to bronze, and then so silver would be the warriors, and bronze that goes to merchants, and then you go to peasants. But it doesn't actually work like that. In Evola, what happens is that somehow the the golden rulers, or the golden age leaders, lose control. I don't actually quite know how that happens, but they lose control to the priest caste, who take over and bring about a degradation to the Silver Age, which he describes as being lunar and feminine, and bound up with ideas of the moon goddess and the earth mother and all of these kind of feminine symbols. And the reason that it really struck me this time is that, well, there were two reasons really. One is that so basically what happens during this lunar feminine age is that the kind of masculine vitality is looked down upon, and it's seen as being infernal and somehow like beast-like, and eventually, the men, or the men with warrior spirit, get kind of fed up of this and end up basically killing the priests and taking over. But when they do that, they have lost the kind of the golden true spirituality. They come merely as brutes or something, something like that. And this ushers in what he calls the Bronze Age, right? This is the kind of the Bronze Age mindset, you might say, of someone like, Bronze Age pervert or someone, this is the sort of thing you have in mind. It's the kind of barbarian raider type that comes in the Bronze Age. But his description of this time of the kind of lunar feminine Silver Age has all sorts of strange things that he mentions. Like he says that a lot of the priests will become eunuchs. They literally chop off their members, and some of them will dress up as women and things like that. So you can see why this might resonate in some way with what we're seeing today, because it struck me that there's a lot of things that happen during the Silver Age that seem to be happening all around us, right? The other thing I hadn't quite appreciated before is that these ages that Evola describes, they're not only kind of thousands of years long, and some, they occurred some way off in the mythical past, right? When he's talking about this golden age, he's talking about an age like beyond myth. It's kind of so long lost to us that we're kind of glimpsing it, right? It's not like a kind of actual, it's not like an actual historical period. It is more something that you can glean from reading the myths and legends, okay? But in actual history, that is, in the lived reality that we have, even though we may be living in the Iron Age, for example, you still get glimpses of Golden Age energy or Silver Age energy or Bronze Age energy at different points. And I hadn't understood that before. It's like I think the word you used, Kat, was fractal. It's like a kind of miniature cycle within a cycle, right? So the Iron Age has its own Golden Age. This is very confusing, but it's kind of like, and then even within that, even within each of the ages, they each have their own little tiny little. So even I don't know, like if you can imagine several nested Iron Ages in each other, even that has its own little mini Golden Age. Whereby I don't know.
Yeah, maybe relative to the fact that it's in the Iron Age, but there are cycles within cycles. Certainly, the thing that I would maybe interject at this point is that it's when discussing this, because you first approached me and you said you wanted to talk about the solar and the lunar races, yes. And and these cycles of the ages, right? And how exactly does this inversion and degeneration occur? So before we even start delving into that, I think we really need to understand the difference between the historical plane on which things are occurring in a linear timeline, trying to, pin down a particular date when this may or may not have happened, versus like the meta-historical, which is outside of and above time. So there are ways in which, if you've got kind of like your meta history up here and your waves of history like this, sometimes it's going to come up and they're going to meet and you'll have that kind of perfect reflection. And other times it's just kind of down here and the reflection's imperfect. So in this discussion about ages, it's probably best to stick first to understanding what this is on the more metaphysical level before then trying to extrapolate it into, well, where do we see this play out in a historical timeline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, okay, I kind of rambled a bit at the start there, just try to set us up, Kat. But how would you describe then, like, what is the Golden Age? How does it degenerate into the Silver Age? What is the Silver Age, etc.?
All right. Well, let's start with just what is the Golden Age. So, from a metaphysical standpoint, the Golden Age it's a time of existing in a state of being rather than becoming. So this is the time before the fall, however your tradition conceptualizes that. This is a time when, perhaps people didn't actually have physical bodies. That solidification into matter had not yet occurred, nor had it needed to occur. And so, when Evola is speaking about, for example, I would refer people to my Revolt episode on the hierarchical relationship of regality and priesthood, because that really is focusing strongly on this idea, what you brought up, AA, that, the warrior and the priestly natures were at one point in unity. The Golden Age man embodied this as a synthesis within himself. And so the Golden Age peoples were referred to as a race of men without kings. Well, why don't they have kings? They don't need them because each man is sovereign unto himself. He's a master of himself. He has innately the recognition of himself as a divine being who lives in harmony with the dharma of the cosmos. Also, he has no need of priests. What is a priest? A priest is somebody who mediates the divine for those who are unable to. But the Golden Age man does not need to do this. He has direct access to that by virtue of his own innate nature. So what happens when we get to a fall? Well, and we get into the Silver Age. So one of the interesting things about the shift from the Golden Age to the Silver Age is the way in which solar symbolism is viewed. And keep in mind as we go through this discussion, of course, that solar things are associated with a masculine principle, which isn't to say men biologically or anthropologically, but masculine in the sense of that gendered energy, which, we all have to varying degrees. So in the Golden Age, we had the symbol of the sun being seen as, this immutable light, this unchanging thing that is life-giving, vivifying. It's emblematic of a state of being and eternality. But in the Silver Age, we start to see a shift where the sun is now more associated with the rising and the setting. And the sun is on its daily journey going into the underworld and then having to reemerge the next morning victorious at the dawn, or the sun's yearly cycle where at the solstice it's at its lowest light and at the summer solstice it's at its maximum peak. So you get this changeability now, which is exactly what we would expect in the Silver Age, which is under the aegis of the moon. It's a lunar civilization at this point. And it's not yet to the point of the civilization of the mother that Evola talks about, which he says is a remnant from a much older cycle, which, we could say like Lemuria is pretty much what he's pointing to, something that came long before in the South and has no connection to this solar tradition. But because of the fall, so we can say like Hyperborea is Golden Age, Atlantis is Silver Age, just to kind of like keep everybody on the same page for simplicity's sake. You can think of it that way. So when you have that transition from the Hyperborean pole in which the sun is seen as that center point that doesn't change, but is like the linchpin of everything that dances around it, which is also where you get the symbolism of the swastika, which is a Hyperborean symbol, as most people in your audience probably know. Well, now we get into Atlantean civilization, and it's easy to think that this could be a civilization of the mother, because you start to see a lot of symbols of the mother, the goddess, the waters, the serpents coming in. All of these things are signs of the fall, but you also have a tradition where a supernatural woman was said to reside in the West, which is Atlantis, who guarded the golden apples or some kind of grail of some kind. So this is kind of symbolic of now the need for initiation. Because man has fallen from his state of being into becoming, he's no longer immediately aware of his nature as a divine being, but now has to reawaken and reclaim that through initiation, which is kind of what the whole Grail quest symbolizes. Evola's written a whole book on that, which I'm sure you've probably read. And then in addition to this, we start seeing these currents coming up from the south, these very telluric, Amazonian, Dionysian types of spiritualities in which Mother Earth becomes the prime symbol rather than the masculine sun. And I would say, you can almost think of it as the difference between worshiping the sun directly for what it is in principle versus worshiping the effects of the sun, so all of these kind of fertility cults, or this obsession with growth and abundance and material life, for example, which is incidentally really Jupiterian in nature. And astrologically, we kind of consider Jupiter to sometimes be like a secondary solar symbol. So there's this sense where they're looking at the effects of what the sun gives them on this earth, but not to its source. They are very deeply fallen into illusion. So we can say, like, the remnants of this old Lemurian civilization, that was what was left of them, was this cult of the mother, and this very kind of promiscuous sense in which the masculine principle was something shameful or expendable or irrelevant, but it was just kind of considered like bad, not needed. And this is the opposite to an Aryan, Hyperborean, northern spirituality. You have instead this worship of the flesh, of the material earth, a certain promiscuity, not necessarily like a sexual promiscuity, but definitely including that, where rather than people having a spiritual connection with each other, as they're really just engaging on the level of the profane. And these are kind of what we would consider to be spiritually like the plebs, right? These are people who have no rights. They have no ancestors in the sense that they can't claim any descent from a divine being. They're not descended from a god in the way that the Aryan elite in antiquity was. So once this southern strain clashes with this sort of Atlantic Western cycle of what we're kind of calling Atlantis here, what you get is kind of this weird mishmash where we have on the one hand the symbol of the supernatural virgin who bestows immortality. And when we speak of a virgin in this sense, we're speaking of it symbolically. This is the woman who is inaccessible. She cannot be defiled. This is like Aphrodite Urania as opposed to Aphrodite Pandemia. And so it's a very, it's something that's beautiful in form. It's not necessarily something that inspires lust in a man, because you wouldn't ever want to, it'd be like defiling a statue, that's kind of the attitude towards the woman in this case. Contrast that with, Aphrodite Pandemia, who is, just very promiscuous, a temptress, a seductress, very much into, the earthly pleasures of the flesh. And so when that strain meets the polar remnants of Hyperborea in Atlantis, what you then get is a sanitizing of Aphrodite Pandemia into this Demeter-like great mother. She's kind of purified and sanctified through marriage. And this, is the order in which those impulses are reined in, so that they're no longer such a force of chaos. But that's where you're starting to get this clash and this mishmash of symbolism going on. So as this is occurring, simultaneously, we have that southern strand, which is already very degraded and fully telluric. And then we have this Silver Age Atlantis all coming into this kind of like coalescence of illusion, right? So we have the sun was referred to as the northern light, and the moon was referred to as the southern light, in the sense that, it's not, the sun is the source of its own light, right? You've probably figured that out by now with all the Evola that you've read, because he goes on and on about this in his books. And the moon, of course, being lunar, is a reflective light. It doesn't generate its own source. So when we now have Silver Age people who don't know their own divine origins, or they have to seek it out and prove themselves worthy of it through initiation, we now start to see, for example, the priestly caste and the warrior caste now become separate. And we have the priestly caste who is, mediating this interaction with the divine, whereas the warrior caste is still seeking it out through their own rituals and initiations. But in either case, there is a sense of no longer participating directly with it, but stepping back from it, being external to the divine and contemplating it. And that's the key difference here. And Evola says in Synthesis of the Doctrine of the Race that the priestly caste becomes lunar, and they approach the divine the way that a woman approaches a man, from a place of submission rather than a place of mastery and true participation and active will. Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, in Revolt, where he's only got, I think it's chapter 27, right? The civilization of the mother. This is the kind of main place he talks about it. He says that what you've just described, Kat, has all sorts of consequences for how they want to run things. And when you read his description of what the civilization of the mother becomes, I mean, it just sounds like communism to me.
That's exactly what it is. So, the masculine principle is one of differentiation, and differentiation produces hierarchy, but the feminine principle is about equalization. And what do you get when equality is your prime good? Well, you get communism, you get promiscuity. There is no hierarchy in that sense. Nobody's better than anybody else. So you even see this like within the different funeral rites. For example, within a lunar civilization, burial is typical, and in a solar civilization, it's cremation. Well, the reason for that is that cremation, of course, is using the element of fire as this purifying force to separate the soul from the body, break its attachment to the body, and propel it into the heavens. As the smoke and the flames rise, there's this ascent that's implied in the burning. But with burial, you're going into the earth. And these lunar spiritualities have as kind of one of their fundamental principles that, we all come from the earth and we all go back to the earth. And there you will see a focus more on underworlds in the afterlife rather than celestial abodes and heavens. So, you've got like the Greek Hades or the Jewish Sheol, rather than this idea that, in the Vedic tradition, the gods are in their celestial abodes, or in Christianity, there's heaven. They also have hell too, which kind of just illustrates that Christianity is a bit of a mishmash of these two different strains coming together. So, and we see this again when we look at, attitudes towards death. You have the path of the moon, or the path of the ancestors, which in the Vedic tradition, called the Pitrayana, takes you basically back into just like dissolution into the biospirit. You're said to become food for the gods, and you just kind of go back into the primordial soup of your tribal stock. And you just find dissolution there. There's no transcendence, as opposed to the solar path or the path of the gods, the Devayana, through the door of the sun. This is one that will create a being that is so impressive that even the gods are said to want to worship it. Because of that heroic action that is needed to achieve that, it is said to make one superior to the gods even. So big difference there in how they're looking at this stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's basically like the Silver Age turns everything about the Golden Age upside down.
Yeah.
He constantly uses words like inversion, or there's another word that there's a longer word that he uses, which I've only ever seen in Evola. What does he call it? An
involution?
An involution. Yeah, he's always using the word involution. What does that even mean? What's
kind of the opposite of evolution, whereas instead of like going on this upward spiral towards progress, we actually started at the apex and are now spiraling downward. So it's a degenerative process.
Yeah, like a devolution, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, just some of the aspects of this. Why do various men start dressing up as women, or becoming eunuchs during the Silver Age?
Well, the fact that they had priests who were eunuchs or who dressed as women, I think, is really telling. It's a very literal expression of the fact that the masculine principle has been castrated. Masculine virility is now, falling asleep. So, everybody likes to think that the Kali Yuga is this bad thing and we need to fight against it, which we do on an individual level. We need to remain standing amidst the ruins, and that means reinvigorating our solar natures, but from a broader perspective, this cycle and its natural decay is just part of like the play of God. It's Leela. It's meant to be, and it must occur. So as you start to research into this stuff, you will start to find the same themes come up over and over. And the principle of gender is a really common and very important theme in all of these spiritual traditions. Everything is related in some way to this masculine, feminine polarity on some level. Mm-hmm. So, from the perspective of creation, it is said that Purusha, the masculine principle, glanced at Prakriti and she began to unfold into creation, and she just unfolds eternally ever thereafter. Well, on a deeper level, in order for the masculine principle, that part of God, to be able to become more than just potential, but to actualize into its full being, participation in the material world seems to be a requirement. Think of it as like, the myth of Narcissus gazing into his reflection, falling in love with it, and then falling face first into the lake and drowning. This is what's happened to the masculine principle. It's like Shiva gazed into the pond, fell in love, was so enthralled with the beauty of what Shakti was presenting to him, and fell in face first. And in so doing, he will actualize himself. But he must first go through the process. This is a Hermetic principle. It's a principle that is found in various forms of sex magic. For example, this idea that, you go through the white work in the Hermetic process, where the man is reduced to the nature of the feminine. But the red work commences when he kind of violently reasserts that masculine nature. It's like it's almost completely snuffed out. And then at the last moment, it just poof. And then that's the beginning of a new golden age, right? But we can't get there without having gone through the process that generates the heroic action to bring us back to that next starting point. So, from the perspective of our human lives, living in the Kali Yuga sucks, because our souls long for the golden age. It's written into us, it's hardwired in us to desire that. And so living in the Kali Yuga, of course, it feels like a lot of pain and suffering and frustration, but it's not like, this is still part of what God has ordained. This is still part of how creation plays out and how God experiences himself and comes to actualize his own power. So
yeah. So how do we go from, so at the moment you've talked almost kind of like in the world of forms, or in the world you've been describing these, you know, far off mythical races, you know, the Hyperboreans and the Atlantis and so on. How does Evola move from that into our kind of almost like kind of profane actual history, like the, you know, history as it actually happened and as we experience it? Because one of the things that is kind of quite difficult to get one's head around is that Evola, he moves from this world of myth, and then occasionally he'll talk about like actual stuff that happened in history. And all of history, basically, as we know it, is Iron Age, right? So everything plays out within the Kali Yuga as we. I mean, I think somebody tried to. I've got a book somewhere by somebody Jocelyn Godwin, I think her name is, and in there she actually tries to date, you know, when was the Golden Age, when was the Silver Age, and so on. And I think like the dates is like Kali Yuga or the Iron Age starts like 5,000 BC or something, 4,000 BC. So that's basically all of history that as we've, you know, all of recorded history is the Iron Age, right?
Mm-hmm.
But within that, within actual history as it plays out, different people at different times somehow, how do they call it? Like they embody some like strange reflection of the Golden Age or some reflection of the Silver Age, right? It's like a kind of analogy to it rather than being the thing itself. It's just a kind of glimpse of it, right? So I don't know, somebody like trying to think of like actual historical figures like, I don't know, like Cyrus the Great or Alexander or somebody like this. They glimpse something, or I don't know, if you pick a different figure like Muhammad, say, right, who when he was leading like the Arab hordes in 600 or whatever, these are like either embodying like Golden Age or Bronze Age type energies, right? So everybody knows, for example, Evola was kind of like into the Romans. He liked the Romans. And then everybody kind of has an idea, well, wasn't really that for Christianity. And then when you actually like read his accounts of like why that is, he says like, well, Rome had a kind of something going, right? It was kind of I don't know, it was kind of reflecting the Bronze Age, or at different points it was maybe even reaching upwards further, right? But then I can't remember, is it in Revolt or is it somewhere else? I think it's in Revolt, where he basically says like, you know, when Christianity starts to spread, it kind of coincides with a lot of these same things that we've been talking about, like the, you know, like the cult of the cult of the Virgin Mother, and you know, you start to see a lot of the same kind of like weird communist stuff happening, and equality and anti-hierarchical principles and things. And then he says, but then, almost like despite all of that, it starts breaking out again. Like the some reflection of the golden of the solar energy starts breaking out again in the Ghibelline Middle Ages, right? The Ghibellines and the Guelphs, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor at a certain point started to embody once again the kind of regality that he talks about. So he kind of like, he's up for them. So even like, this is kind of a strange thing. It's like, it's not that he's saying, oh, well, Christianity's good or Christianity's bad. He's just saying, like, well, all of these religions can embody these different energies at different times, almost like they're just an exterior shell or vessel that carries these other archetypes, whatever they happen to be. Is that right, or how would you characterize what I've?
Yeah, so I want to say it's in the foreword of Revolt where Evola refers to these as like civilizational mountain peaks. And, occasionally you will have arise a great civilization that embodies much of the world of tradition, such that, up from the top, they can kind of all see each other's peaks, but us down below the clouds, we don't necessarily get, the full spectrum of what's happening. So this is one of those cases where, how I said sometimes the wave of history rises up and meets meta history, meets the world of tradition. That's what is happening with these civilizations. The conditions, for whatever reason, were like culturally, geographically, chronologically right for that spirit to manifest itself again, even if it's just a brief moment to kind of keep it alive, pass it on for future generations. But inevitably, because of the nature of material reality, it is also subject to decay. So, you had this idea that as long as Rome still stood, the world would not end, which is, ancient peoples thought their civilizations were eternal. They didn't think about it collapsing or ending. Like the fact that we here in the modern world think about the collapse so much, to the point that we're all prepping, they would be like, that's kind of a sign of sickness in your civilization. But they had the sense that they were participating in something eternal because on some level they actually were. Those principles with which they were connected are eternal, will, continue to arise, maybe with less and less frequency the deeper we go into the Kali Yuga. But because it's an eternal principle, it never really dies.
Yeah, so he says this is in a chapter called The Syncope of the Western Tradition. Did I say that correctly? This is chapter 31 of Revolt. He says, the advent of Christianity marked the beginning of an unprecedented decline. In the previous pages, I emphasized the central force in Rome and its unfolding through a complex development. In the course of this development, heterogeneous influences acted only fragmentarily vis-a-vis the supernatural element that gave to Rome its specific physiognomy. The Rome that emancipated itself from its Aboriginal Atlantic and Etruscan Pelasgian roots destroyed in rapid succession the great centers of the more recent southern civilization, despised Greek philosophers, and banned the Pythagorean sect, outlawed the Bacchanalia, thus reacting against the avant-garde of the Alexandrian deities. That same Rome, that is the sacral, patrician, and virile Rome, inspired by the notions of Ius, Phas, and Mos, increasingly fell under the spell of the onslaught of the Asiatic cults that rapidly infiltrated the structures of the empire and altered its physiognomy. Rome witnessed the return of the symbols of the mother and of the most spurious forms of the various mystical and pantheistic cults of the southern deities, which were a far cry from the Demetrian clarity of the origins and were associated with the corruption of the customs and of the innermost Roman virtus more than with the corruption of the institutions. And then he goes on. Now, to me, that sounds like he's describing something analogous that happened in the real world from what you're discussing, the change from the golden age to the silver age. Have I read that correctly?
Correct.
Is that what's happening here?
So yeah. He is now coming down. And so in the first half of Revolt, he's really just kind of sticking to like the metaphysical principles of the world of tradition. And then in the second half, he's actually attempting to pin it to a timeline. and give examples of these metaphysical principles and their degeneration, in actual fact, something that happened that we can, kind of relate to and understand it. So, yeah, Christianity doesn't get I mean, I wouldn't say it's an unfair hearing, but it's not overly flattering in the sense that, he pins a lot of the blame for the descent into unconsciousness of the European mind and spirit on Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, he does later say that the spirit reawakens within Christianity, right? But
yeah.
This is actually quite common, I've discovered. Evola says it, Spengler says it. There's a guy called Gobbin who says it. There's various other guys who say it as well. Basically, that it's the rediscovery of the Aryan spirit, despite the religion. It kind of almost like comes from within, almost like a kind of racial principle, as opposed to. There's a book that I have here called "The Germanization of Christianity," I think it's called. Where basically they attribute what happened to the fact that it's kind of like inborn to who the people are, rather than any facet of what the religion is. Can you speak a bit more to that? Is that fair?
So Evola says that what is traditional in Christianity is not exclusively Christian, but what is not traditional is exclusively Christian, in the sense that, like, it's the things that are Christian in particular that set it apart from other religions, those kind of dogmas and doctrines. Those things are anti-traditional. The traditional elements that they have within it have largely been co-opted from the fact that they rode the coattails of the Roman Empire to their global success. Not because the church itself actually embodied or conveyed these traditional principles. It did provide like an institutional framework for those principles to, still see some life as basically an empty husk for a time before those two kind of fell over and decayed. So Evola is not really of the opinion that Christianity is exemplifying any kind of traditional spirituality, because, a lot of the principles of Christianity are very lunar and therefore diametrically opposed to a solar spirituality. Which is interesting because Christ is a solar principle, but Christ is, there's the weird kind of combination of the fact that, well, Christ is a man who actually had to live as a man and die and then be resurrected. And so now you're getting that rising and setting symbolism of the solar principle, as well as the fact that, but he's also the Son of God. So now you get the unchanging solar principle, and it's kind of a strange syncretism that's going on.
Yeah, there's no ways around it. He's in Revolt and elsewhere. He almost won't say it. He always describes it as the religion that has come to predominate in the West. Like that's his way of describing Christianity most of the time. It's almost like he doesn't even want to use the word. Is this unique to Christianity in Evola's treatment, or are there other specific religions that he's kind of down on for whatever reason? Because this is something that I haven't quite got to grips with when it comes to the perennialists, right? Sometimes it seems like the actual content of these religions doesn't matter, right? It's like, well, it's almost like they're vessels that just carry energies, right, at different times, these kind of eternal principles. But at other times, it seems like the actual content of them does matter in the way that you were just describing. But can you think of any other
all of the Abrahamic religions fall into that category. All of the Abrahamic religions are, either lunar or telluric to some degree or another. The solar elements that are incorporated in them are not original or natural to them. They were things that are, often kind of attached later on.
So he also does not have nice things to say about Judaism, for
Well, it's
example.
not a question about saying nice things or bad
Yeah,
things. I wouldn't put a judgment on it
yeah,
like that. It's a question of if you want to recover an Aryan Hyperborean solar spirituality that,
uh-huh,
if you're a race of the spirit, you feel yourself to be of a solar race, then this would probably be of interest to you. But if you don't feel yourself to be of a solar race, then it's not appropriate for you, and you should choose something else. This is why I don't really care what religion people choose to practice, because I feel like if you put in enough self-reflection, you'll find the path that's right for your inner nature. And for many people that especially in the Kali Yuga, that's going to be a lunar path. The question is, does any given religion, regardless of what kind it is, does it offer you a pathway to the type of transcendence that is appropriate to a solar racial spirit?
mhm.
And the answer with Christianity is no, it does not, nor do Islam or Judaism, because the Abrahamic religions are meant for a lunar civilization.
And I mean, this seems to come out in the symbology. Like, I mean, I did it. I had a guest on one of my streams recently, who's a friend of mine, who's a Christian, and we kind of started talking about this a little bit because I was in the middle of writing this book, so it was on my mind. And I think he said something like, he associates fire with the infernal. Fire is like something bad,
Yeah.
And
You have this transposition of it being like this life-giving, vivifying, purifying principle to something that is either hellish or at best is just like a material comfort in terms of being able to stay warm and cook food. But it has no real potency left anymore.
Right. So, I mean, what would it really mean to, for example, embody the lunar? Like, let's say now, right, that I decided, right, I am basically like lunar. That's my thing. I'm Lunar-Feminine. I want to follow that path. Okay. Now, I would say being a Persian Welshman, that may be difficult because especially Persia, particularly associated with fire religions, let's just say, right? But let's just pretend that I wanted to embody like moon energy, right? What would that actually look like in practice? Like, what would I be striving to get to if I wanted to follow that?
Well, I don't know if it's something that you necessarily consciously choose to do so much as something that your spirit just draws you towards naturally, and if that's who you are, then that's who you are. There's better to play that role perfectly than to try to be something that you're not. So, the lunar nature of the Silver Age, what is that all about? Equality, communitarianism, universal brotherhood. And it is really, see, people like to make fun of my astrology, but this is where it comes in handy, because if you understand deeply the symbolism of the sun and moon and how it plays out there, you understand it so much more deeply when Evola talks about it. So, what are some of the things that are associated with the moon? Well, forgetfulness is one of them. Changeability, fickleness, it's reflective, it's submissive, it's contemplative. So these are all things that you see in a person who is lunar. You have, there's this sense of like wanting like this sort of like soporific escapist peace, like the Eloi and the time machine and the way that they live, very, very lunar. But the golden age is a different kind of peace. And that's a peace that is characterized by men standing honorably before other men and recognizing them as such, because they each are sovereign unto themselves and participate in the divine order through their own active will. There's this sense that the golden age men are, self-mastered. They possess this heroic virility. They are active. And so, for example, one of the things that you see a lot in the dissident right, which is an incredibly lunar behavior, and I'm not pointing fingers because God knows I'm guilty of it myself, but hey, free pass for me because I'm a woman, is the tendency to want to intellectualize about spirituality, but never have a praxis. So I will often see people talking and debating about the merits of this or that spirituality, arguing about religion and stuff. But when it comes down to it, none of them are actually like seriously practicing any real pathway to transcendence. And I'm not talking about just like, oh, you go to church every Sunday or something. I don't consider that praxis. That's just showing up, but it doesn't mean you did anything. Mm-hmm. So this tendency of the lunar person to want to just go with the flow, let things happen, a lack of agency, for example. I don't know if you're familiar. Actually, you are, because I know you recommended it. The Bow and the Club, there's that essay in there on the evasive man. Mm-hmm. The evasive man is like the epitome of the modern lunar man. He can't keep his word. He's lazy. He is untrustworthy. He's unreliable. He's soft. Like lunar people often even just look very moon-like, for example. they do. And right. If you look in, I should have scanned these for you, but in Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race, he has all of the just pages and pages of pictures of people in which he classifies their spiritual physiognomy.
That's awesome.
And
I've got that book somewhere.
The funny thing is, though, like, I really recommend people to get a copy of this and just look at these pictures if possible, because he's so spot on in the way he describes them. And it's not necessarily something that's a physical feature that you can measure and extrapolate and quantify. But as you just look at their faces as a whole and kind of do a vibe check on them, you do get the sense that they are exactly the type of race of spirit as what he's, described in this book of the different types of race of spirit. Mm-hmm. And for the people who are of a solar race or a lunar race or one of the telluric races, they have a particular vibe about them in which those forces behind the personality, behind the physical body, are acting upon our physical material in these subtle yet detectable ways. It's like, I was talking about this yesterday with my partner. I was just like, why do I simultaneously love and hate Art Deco? I don't know what it is. I feel like I want to look at it, but when I do, I'm just disappointed. And it's the same thing I realized as I was looking through these pictures. A lot of the images of, for example, like the Hitler Youth and these just very idealized, like kind of Nazi youth types, and their, just the style that they had to them, and the way that they're often stylized in art, like Arno Brecker and statues and things like that. Mm-hmm. The form is beautiful. Aesthetically, just based on the form, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's no light in it. It's too sterile. And in these people, like, you see this in people that you pass on the street, right? You know when you see somebody who has dead eyes versus somebody who has fire behind their eyes. And you can tell the difference between somebody who has the fire of a warrior versus the fire of a disciplined ascetic. Mm-hmm. You can just tell. Is there any way that we can sit there and scientifically measure these people's eyes and determine like what it is that's structurally and physically different about their eyes that gives them this different look? No, science will never tell you that. But, on a spirit level, we can pick up on that.
But from what you're describing, Kat, I'm imagining there are a lot of people who are, let's just say, I don't know, like solar types, let's just say, who were born into a kind of lunar society or a lunar religion or something like that. And yet they're kind of, because that's their home, because that's their kind of background, they feel like loyal to those things, right? I think like I guess what I'm saying is there must be lots of like spiritually solar Christians, let's just say. They're not all like moon people in the way that you've described, right?
True. And the ones
there must be kind of these kind of misalliances, I guess, from what you've been describing.
Yeah, definitely. And, sometimes you will see Catholics who feel really drawn towards a solar nature, and maybe they seek that out through like the traditional Latin Mass and the more, the older style of Catholicism rather than the modern new Vatican II stuff, which is very, very lunar. But, there is that loyalty to the religion they were brought up in, or just what they believe to be true, or what they want to be true. But excuse me. So, and sometimes you'll also, maybe have, probably less common in the Kali Yuga, but you might have the case where a lunar person is born into a more solar lifestyle and is consistently like feeling drawn back to like lunar ways of expressing it. For example, it's a problem that maybe you would see frequently in Buddhism, which in its traditional form is very solar, but then you hand it over to Western people who are very lunar by nature. And what do they do with it? They turn it into something new agey.
Something gay, right? Something just
gay. Their interpretation of it starts to be colored by their inner quality.
Yeah.
They start to read the doctrines and filter the texts through the lens of their spiritual race. And, so this is where you just get all these kind of dogmatic conflicts. Well, one of the places where you get them. But ultimately, it's kind of like, I think people who, even if you're not aware of race of the spirit or whatever, you can just kind of tell like when somebody's a little bit more one or the other, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what the lunar is. I've just gone back to that civilization of the of the mother, and I'm just picking out some of the kind of phrases that he uses here. He says, the corresponding pathos of utter dependence, humility, passivity, surrender, and renunciation of one's will. And I think that what you're describing as lunar, like, I don't know, something like Islam, for example, seems to demand all of those things, right? But it seems to be like a kind of, I mean, I think it literally means like submission or something, doesn't it?
Yes.
Where you have to kind of run, your, and I think that idea is everywhere. Like you have to give up your ego. You have to, I've been reading the, just before Christmas, I started reading the Tao. I don't know if you ever read that, Kat. I was just like, Evola says, choose a tradition. This one looks cool. So I was just like, okay, let's start reading it. But in there, there's I got one which is annotated, right? And in there, the translator goes off on one about how this idea that you have to kind of completely sublimate and destroy your own ego is like not true. Like even in the Tao, he kind of so that's something that like does the solar man, rather than destroy what people call the will or the ego or whatever, what does he do? He kind of achieves mastery through it or something like that. But I mean, how do these things work?
There's, talking about the ego, I mean, there's two different ways to conceptualize it. So one is the sense that, you put your will aside and you submit to God. The other, the more solar interpretation, is a detachment from desire and craving such that you can command these forces and do so in a way that does not corrupt you. So I have, I marked out two spots in synthesis here where he gives a reasonably succinct definition of the solar and the lunar races. So let me just read these to you. And then we can kind of discuss it. So the solar or Olympic solar race corresponding to the blood in the Hyperborean tradition is to be considered superior and anterior to all others in the cycle in question. So this is the original point he's saying. It has as characteristic a sort of natural supernaturality, spirit and power, dominating calm and readiness for precise and absolute action, a sense of centrality and unshakability, and in its external effects, that virtue which the ancients referred to the numinous quality, from numen, as superiority that directly and irresistibly imposes itself, that arouses simultaneously terror and veneration, are the marks of this race of the spirit, because of which it is naturally predestined to command, and at most, to the royal function. Ice and fire unite within it, as in the confused symbols of the original Nordic seat and of the cycle where it eminently and primordially manifested itself. Ice as transcendence and inaccessibility, fire as the radiant solar quality of beings that give, awaken life, and bring light, but always in a sovereign remoteness and almost indifference, as in a trail, not for some transport, inclination, or human concern. Now, by comparison, he says this about the lunar race. He says, first, let us indicate the lunar race or Demetrian race. According to the analogical relation, while the solar element is that which has in itself its own light and in general its own principle, the sun being in this respect the center of a given planetary system, the lunar element is that which instead receives or draws its own light and its own principle from other things. In the lunar race, the sense of spiritual centrality has therefore been lost, either because of degeneracy, the moon being thought of as a dull sun, or because of passive crossbreeding with races of other cycles of the telluric type, which have degraded its original solar quality. The moon, Backhoffen notes, was also called heavenly earth by the ancients. There is therefore a sublimation of the law of the earth, the fate that presents itself as cosmic harmony and natural law. Man here no longer feels himself to be the active center of spiritual reality. He is not this reality itself, but rather he who contemplates it, who studies its laws, who surpasses material action and tellurism through contemplation, but still does not reach spiritual action. So this is really important because he's identifying the lunar man, like, in order to understand the lunar man, you have to understand the solar man. You have to understand them in like this polarity and this tension of opposites. And the fact that, while there is a way in which they are definitely opposites and not the same, there's also kind of this fluid spectrum between them on which normal human beings will fall. So, most of us in the Kali Yuga are probably predominantly lunar race, but some of us might have a touch of, the solar race. I don't know if I've ever met somebody that I would say was like purely of a solar race. Probably not going to find them. And then, of course, you have the telluric races as well, which is something different. We can get into that later. But there is this sense that man is no longer sovereign unto himself. He needs someone else to mediate the divine for him. He needs somebody else to give him laws. He sits, he thinks, he contemplates. The lunar man is the intellectual. That cerebrality and intellectualism is attributed to the moon. It's contemplative, it's reflective. This is why Evola says the priestly class is lunar. The priestly man is not the regal man. He's a degeneration from that. So, you have these very spiritually feminine traits. These are the people, like, you will see it in the types of spiritualities people are drawn to, but also their types of lifestyles as well. And then, of course, the solar man is, this isn't like a Promethean sense. There's not this egotistical sense where they're believing that they're gods or who try to gain the powers of the gods that they shouldn't have. They just naturally do not belong to the earthly realm because, they haven't fallen so far into illusion that they've forgotten their true natures. They still have this natural and clear memory of divine origins. And this is the state which initiation is designed to produce. Which is why initiation is a solar thing.
So in preparation for this stream, Kat, I looked over passages from Eros and was it the Metaphysics of Sex? Eros and the Mysteries of Love, I think that book is called.
Mysteries of Love. Yeah.
Which has got some hilarious passages, including one where Evola basically says that I mean, he literally just says that the essence of women is captured in the blowjob, which I couldn't believe it when I read over it. I don't know if you're familiar with that passage.
I am familiar with that passage, and I almost quoted it in a video I made a couple months ago.
I mean, I put some of them on Twitter early on. Let me see if I can find them a second. But the descriptions that you read out there are very close also to the descriptions that he gives to the female. The description of the lunar energy is also very close to his descriptions of just women in general, right? That he talks about in Eros. Let me just see if I can find this. Hold on a minute. Here we go. So I just posted a few, knowing that we were going to have this stream. He says, let me just find that blowjob quote a second because it's just hilarious. He says, what D'Annunzio said in his book Fire about one of his female characters, as if the whole body of the woman had assumed the quality of a sucking mouth, not only takes place on a subtle plane, but in reality makes the erotic practice of fellatio seem the best expression of the ultimate essence of woman, which I just think is funny. But he basically says in this section of the book that the women basically, when they're following their path, can either embody the lover or the mother, right? But in both cases, they find their center in a way on like another being, whether it's a man or the baby, right? But basically, it's a lunar because she's not the source of energy herself. She has to kind of latch on to somebody else, if that makes any sense, or center her being on the man or on the child. Which is similar to what you're saying. The priests who, for example, the lunar priests would, rather than embody the spirit themselves, they have to approach it almost like a woman approaches a man. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Now I get, and then in that same book, if I can remember, I didn't read. The body, the path of the hero, which is again these two been describing, but Evola kind of is proact, like he prefers the action path always, right? The question I have, Kat, is that given what he says about men and women in that book, does that mean that all women basically have to like go lunar, or like how does somebody's actual kind of gender or sex play into this that we've been discussing so far?
Well, that's a pretty big topic, so we'll do what we can. So what was the first question? Let me start there.
Like, let's say you're a woman, right? And these things that he's saying in this book are, you can't quite you have to latch on to somebody else, whether as mother or as lover. How could you do that and be solar? It seems to me that women are just lunar in Evola's conception. So, like, how could it?
every man today is also lunar, but Evola also has the telluric races or the titanic races that we haven't talked about. So you've got like the Amazonians and the Dionysians. He's drawing a lot of this from J.J. Backhoffen, and just kind of then putting it into a more like metaphysical context. But you have these telluric races that are they have a way of being that is just oriented around immediate gratification, impulsiveness and instincts, irrationality and passions. And, it's definitely easier for a woman to thrive according to that nature than a man. In these telluric races of spirit, masculinity is not very well developed. And you have a femininity that really tends towards heterism or promiscuity. If you do have bonds of blood, they tend to be collectivist in nature. So, like kind of, I don't know if there's many of them around anymore, but kind of like the blood and soil nationalists and stuff. That's a very telluric way of thinking about one's ethnic stock. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got like the one human race types where, who deny blood bonds at all. But this stage is kind of the last phase of the decomposition of the race of the spirit, because there's no longer any higher law that holds back the forces of chaos. So, as a woman, it's like, well, can you ever develop a solar nature on your own? I don't know that just being a woman physically necessarily precludes you from developing some solar components. But the question then becomes problematic if you tie woman's salvation to being able to reflect off a man and you have no solar men available because they're all equally lunar or telluric themselves. And then you get you get the Amazonians who confront men as if they are men themselves, and men who don't know how to achieve anything except through like brute force. It's the caricature of the shrieking harpy feminist versus the caricature of the stereotypical manly man who, like, he doesn't really know how to be a man, but he thinks if he's loud and has big muscles and gets angry and bangs a lot of women, that must make him masculine. This is a very like, Amazonian way of being.
Andrew Tate, for example,
yes.
right?
Yes, yeah. He's selling an Amazonian version of masculinity, and that's a version that may well work very well with Amazonian women. But it's not solar, and it's not even pretending to be solar. Sometimes on the flip side, you get like the Dionysian race of spirit, where there is kind of an attempt to free oneself from these telluric bonds, from the prison of the senses, which they do through, use of substances or orgiastic sex or whatever. But there's this ecstatic, frenzied banging against the walls of the prison that often just degenerates into escapism. So, that's very, these are the people who like drink too much ayahuasca and think that they're spiritually enlightened, when in fact they can't have that experience unless they go to another ayahuasca ceremony. So to go back now to your question, what do you do as a woman? This is a question that I've pondered over for years at this point, because I was like, well, is there a solar pathway for a woman to achieve liberation that does not require the use of a man? Simply because, what do you do if you can't find a suitable one? A woman with dignity certainly is not going to be elevated by serving an inferior man, and neither will he be elevated in that way either. But after much pondering, the conclusion I came to was that, I think both men and women need each other for this, and there's no way out of this without the other. However, there are different types of woman. And so going back to what I mentioned before about the difference between Aphrodite Urania versus Aphrodite Pandemia, you can either be the kind of woman who drags men down into materiality through the use of sex and other pleasures of the flesh, and traps him in a cycle of generation where his only immortality is the next generation. Or you can be Aphrodite Urania, where it's a more of an embodiment of that supernatural virgin. Not necessarily a virgin in the physical sense, but a spiritual virgin in the sense that no matter what, nothing defiles her because she's secure in herself. This is kind of the state of, the absolute woman. In the middle of that, you have that Demeter type, the mother that he talked about. That's certainly, a path for a woman to take that is, not this toxic version of being the sucking woman, right? If you don't want to be that, but you're also not self-possessed enough to go to the other extreme, Demeter's a pretty happy medium, because most women, I think, find the service of their child a lot more satisfying than they would find the service of a husband that they found inadequate, for example. And so, that's going to be kind of the most prevalent path that I think women will end up being drawn to. Nothing wrong with that in either case. It's just, these are kind of the three pathways. But I don't really see, at least from what I've kind of pondered and researched and thought about and discussed, I haven't really come up with a solution in which woman can achieve this completely on her own. The closest I've come is that, and women do ask me this a lot, what can I do if I can't find a man? It's like, well, you can always give yourself over just to the service of the masculine principle generally. Like, if you cannot find a man who embodies the Shiva principle, then work for Shiva himself. For some women, this would have, in the past, this would have meant, being a nun. But for other women in the modern age, this could take a lot of different qualities. It could even just be something as simple as like focusing on developing a healthy relationship with your own inner masculine, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in some of these passages that I was quoting earlier on, there's a real how can I say, there's a kind of darkness in, I say darkness, but there's a kind of nasty side of women that Evola draws out here. I was wondering if you could explain, like, what some of these terms mean. I guess before we hit the super chats here, he says a Persian legend indicates the ingredients of which a woman is composed as the hardness of a diamond, the sweetness of honey, the cruelty of a tiger, the warm brightness of a fire, and the coolness of snow. These ambivalences, the same as those met with in the archetype of the divine woman, lie at the basis of another set of traits in feminine psychology, the coexistence of a disposition towards pity and a disposition towards a special cruelty. I'll just read a bit more of this, because the reason I'm reading this, Kat, is to the point you were just discussing. It almost sounds like the encounter with a woman, as Evola describes it in Eros, is actually a situation of grave danger for the man. Which will, there's almost a kind of like the possibility of like being devoured by the woman in some strange way. I'll just read on a second and then I'll let you comment. He says Lombroso and Ferrero observed some time ago how woman is simultaneously more pitying and yet more cruel than a man. For her capacity for a loving protection and compassion is often accompanied by a lack of feeling, ruthlessness, and a destructive violence that, once let loose, take a far greater hold on her than they do on the man. History bears witness to this in collective forms when rebellions and lynchings have taken place, as it is obvious and rather trivial for us, in company with the two writers just cited, to link feminine pity to the maternal disposition or Demeter element in woman. Her cruelty must instead be explained by referring to another of her aspects, namely to the most profound essence of female sexuality. The link between cruelty and sexuality was dramatized even in classical antiquity in the type of baconet and maenad. However, it is important to note the presence of this characteristic, which is not unrelated to the sucking quality mentioned earlier, behind even the profane and not just the exalted forms of feminine sexuality. This is the cold dimension of woman as an earthly and human embodiment of the Virgin, of Durga and as yin. And it is here that the characteristics shown by the most superficial psychology of the sexes are inverted. And now he goes on to this somewhat kind of how can I say, like he has this thesis basically that even though it seems that the man is active and the woman is passive, actually there's a kind of inversion that goes on where it's actually the woman that's active and the man that is passive when it comes to sexual encounters. And hold on a minute. I think this is the passage. He says, leaving all of that aside, the element of cruelty and coldness in a woman can be shown on the moral plane. For if there are some women who are proud of a heroic man and the extraordinary deeds he does for love of her, because these deeds enhance her worth indirectly, there is also the type who deems her lover's renunciation of all higher manly valor and his possible fall into ruin on her behalf the strongest proof of his love for her. One of Don Bryce's characters said that the man who lost himself wholly on a woman was not a man. However strong his love for her, the woman would despise him. But the woman in the book reported that it was true that the woman would despise him, but that she would also love him all the more. It was not in regard to the so-called vamp, but in general, that Remarque adopted the fable of the rocky boulder that the wave loved. The wave foamed and whirled around the boulder and kissed it day and night and hugged it in her white arms and begged it to come to her. She loved it and tossed it around, and in this way slowly sapped it until one day the boulder was wholly worn away at its bottom and yielded and fell into the arms of the wave. And for some time there was no longer any boulder to play with or love or dream of. There was only a stone drowned at the bottom of the sea. The wave felt disappointed and set herself to look for another rock. Women, wrote Martin, are ruthless about the evil they do to men they love. Right, so I've said a lot there, Cap, but what is all of that about? Like, what is Evola getting at when it comes to this?
All right, so there's a few things to unpack there. So he mentions the Durga aspect of woman, the yin aspect. This is that dark, watery, infernal nature that underpins materiality. And this is the essence of the feminine. And of course, as biological women, we often have, I would say for the most part, unless there's like something psychologically wrong with her, most of us have access to this pretty easily. Now, in the sense when a man and a woman are coming together for any kind of sexual relation, that man can, through her, access the potency of this yin feminine energy. And it's very dangerous to him. So Evola mentions in another book that's not immediately coming to me which one it is, but he mentions, there's two categories of myth in regards to women and their effect on men when they try to seduce them. So in the one category, she's the source of man's fall, for example, in the well-known biblical story of the Garden of Eden. But in another category of myth, she is the ticket to his transcendence. She is the grail. So for a solar man, this should not be a problem. But for a lunar man or a telluric man, yes, his masculinity can easily be destroyed by these forces that he's participating in, especially if he hasn't built himself up such that he can withstand them, let alone transmute the poison into a medicine.
Mhm.
So the cruelty of women, or, what is commonly now called like shit tests, right? Men are always like, well, why do women shit test us? The reason is that on a fundamental metaphysical level, man needs to prove himself. And I want to say it was Carl Jung who said that woman represents the greatest challenge to masculinity. And I think this is true, whether men like to admit it or not, because there is nothing that will test you more in your masculine principle than a hysterical woman. Every man who's ever had a wife or girlfriend probably knows the sinking feeling or even the abject terror of seeing his female partner descend into hysterics where nothing he says or does is the right thing to do. And there are two...
You just described the last 25 years of my life. No, I'm joking.
There's two ways in which a man tends to deal with this. One is to withdraw completely and just leave her to spiral out of control. The other is to join her in that spiral out of control. Neither of these reassures the woman and tends to bring out worse behavior. Well, why is this? Because woman is counting on man to exemplify the masculine qualities of being a stable center, being that rock in a storm, that point at which is untouched. So if you think, for example, like in ballet, you have a man and a woman dancing and the woman is twirling around and doing all the leaps and stuff, but she's only able to do it because the man is there providing a counterbalance, or he's lifting her, he's spinning her, and he's not doing much himself. His role on stage is actually quite minimal in terms of the flamboyance of it, unless you get like the company of men coming out where they're all doing their gymnastics and stuff. But when it's just the man and the woman, this is the dynamic. Man is there to stabilize and centralize the spiraling chaotic energy of the female. So the shit test is designed to test whether or not a man actually has this masculine center. Is he a stable principle unto himself? Does he have the ability to be non-attached without cutting himself off from emotion through like stonewalling or something like that? Does he have the ability to withstand her onslaught, be unperturbed by it, and then draw her into his center of calm without doing much of anything? Which sounds like it's asking a lot. And it is asking a lot because, of course, women want the best. They want a man that they can count on for all number of practical reasons, but also spiritual ones as well. And so this cruelty in a woman is often designed to elicit this, but you do have cases quite frequently where, you have that sort of toxic woman who just wants to destroy. And the nature of yin energy is naturally destructive. There's nothing wrong with this in and of itself until it, gets turned on, people in your life, or you're self-sabotaging or something. But destructive energy just on its own it is what it is, and it's just part of the world, and it just happens to be something that's of that feminine, disseminating, dissolutory, disintegrating nature. So, if you pull a man in like that and he doesn't have a stable center, he isn't a principle unto himself, he will be destroyed by that. And so this is the nature of the left-hand path. Can a man dabble in that yin energy and transmute it for the purpose of his own transcendence? And it's said that the left-hand path is extremely dangerous. It's like walking a razor's edge, and if you slip, you will be cut, and perhaps fatally so. And so if a man is going into this with a woman and he's, I advise men to choose a woman who is of your caliber, so that, if you're a man who does not know how to handle a very high-strung or high-maintenance woman, it's probably best that you don't pursue them, because that's the kind of woman that will destroy you. And she'll destroy herself at the same time, because she's kind of counting on a man to come and provide that stable access, especially if she's not done much work on herself and doesn't have that within herself. And there are certainly women like that. And it's often a common feature of like people with mental illness as well. So, and there's plenty of that in this day and age among both men and women. And then your final point on the passive versus active in courtship is, on the metaphysical plane, the man is the active principle and the woman is the passive principle. So why is Evola saying that the woman is the active principle in courtship? Why? Well, and he's referring to her as almost like a magnet that draws him in. If he gets into her orbit, he's sucked in against his will. Well, this is what happens when you have a lunar man, because he doesn't have that centrality. He isn't able to stand on his own. He's susceptible to this, right? On a higher plane, if that love can be transmuted from the profane into the sacred, then it flips again. That polarity will flip and he becomes the active principle again. But, and this ties right back into our beginning discussion of the cycle of the ages and how this occurs. It's like, on the grandest metaphysical level, the masculine principle has been sucked in to this yin energy and has to almost be totally dissolved in it and then reawaken, reassert itself stronger than it was before.
Yeah. I'm sure he says somewhere as well that the woman, like the woman as magnet, in a way is like almost like slightly disappointed if she completely succeeds in that. Like she almost like doesn't want, I mean, I guess this is Evola's very kind of like women don't like simps or something like that, right? I mean, he's not saying that, but he's kind of getting at.
I wouldn't say women don't like simps, because women like attention, but women don't respect simps, and women don't have.
Yeah,
a woman will never have a strong eros with a man who is simping for her. It just simply doesn't work that way because the polarity of the relationship has already been inverted.
The one last thing I wanted to touch on before we go to super chats. I've been just so happens that today I've been arguing with a lot of quote unquote trads, right? When I say trads, I don't mean a trad like Evola. I mean,
I know what you mean.
The sorts of people.
The internet subculture, yeah.
Yeah, the internet trads. They've got a picture of like a 16th century peasant girl as their backdrop, and I sent out a tweet where I basically said, listen, trying to sell there's this idea that in that kind of trad space that if you basically start a family as a man, right, and be like a husband and a father, that's it. Like that's like the highest peak of masculinity reached. Job done, right? This is the most masculine thing that you can do. And I just think that's a lie. It's just not true. I mean, I'm a father and a husband. I'm a father and a husband, right? And I mean, whichever way you try to spin it, I see it as a cope to claim that this kind of domesticated life, becoming like a domesticated man in that way, is masculine. I don't think it is. I think that the kind of virility that Evola describes is he has something much else in mind than simply kind of like dwindling into a husband. And he has this to say in Eros. I'll just read it. It's a very brief quote. He says, "It is not wrong to say that in every higher civilization, man has never been deemed to be truly a man as long as he submits to the double bond of mother and wife and exhausts the sense of his own existence in that sphere," which seemed to me to be kind of, him kind of agreeing with what I was saying. Of course, famously, he never married or had kids himself, and has other critiques of the family as well. But what do you think of this debate, Kat, from your own point of view?
Well, I mean, I agree with him in principle, which is not me telling people not to have children or that it's worthless to have children, because there's always people who assume that. But from the perspective of what you're saying and what Evola is saying, if I'm walking down the road eating an apple and I just chuck my apple core and an apple tree happens to sprout, does that make me a gardener or a farmer? No, it doesn't. And likewise, it takes absolutely no talent or skill to father a child. So simply being a father or a husband has very little to do with true masculinity. However, I can see why, people who are more lunar or telluric in their spiritual race might think so, because their conception of masculinity is now already quite degraded. It might be the highest that they can conceive of for a man, which is, I guess, fine for them, but I just don't think it's correct. To be that spiritual head of the family, to be the patrician, like Evola speaks very highly of the role of the father in his chapter in Revolt on the patriciate class. Mm-hmm. He has wonderful things to say about what the father means for the family as the head of his family, as the embodiment of the gens of that family. And it's a very important role. And that is where the masculinity comes in being a father, not simply in the generative act of procreation, which any monkey could do. I mean, that in itself is very animalistic. And it's like, well, children are wonderful, of course, and something to be celebrated, but it has no connection to masculinity. If anything, it's quite feminine. It's progress on the horizontal path. You gain immortality through your children, and your great-grandchildren will not even know your name. It's a very short-lived immortality. But hey, the genetics got passed on, so pat yourself on the back, I guess. Meanwhile, Evola, who had no children, wrote all these books and will probably be talking about them still in hundreds of years. You could say that that's kind of a child that's not biological, that will exceed him. Or, people like Leonardo da Vinci, his works will continue to be praised, into the foreseeable future and probably beyond if they survive. So masculinity has a lot more to do with embodying that active will and that stable center than it does about what role you play in your material or domestic life. And that's not to say that a man who's a husband or father cannot become truly masculine. It's not a barrier to that. It's just not particularly relevant.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really attacking here, Kat, is not so much the principle of just siring a child or being a father. It's this idea that raising children, right? The idea of just like doing the day-to-day stuff of raising a child, feeding them, nursing them, taking them out, playing with them, and so on and so forth. That this, okay, it's a nice thing to do, it's a good thing to do, it's pro-social and all these sorts of things. But there's been this kind of push in that trad sphere to try to say that is like, that's also like a masculine thing. It's like the
trad sphere is very, very materialistic, very nihilistic, and despite a lot of professions of faith, are for all intents and purposes actually quite atheistic. And so, you can say, well, doing all of these child-related chores or whatever is the peak of masculinity. It's like, those chores as tasks in and of themselves have nothing to do with it, but the attitude with which you approach it could. It's like the Buddhist saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. What has changed? Your task remains the same, but your inner orientation to it has changed. That's what makes all the difference. So you can exercise a certain masculinity as you go through those tasks with the attitude with which you do them and the character that you build because of that. Or you can just do those tasks because it's on your chore list.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the reason I keep on going on about this is that I remember when I was a teenager in the 90s, there was this kind of quite big feminist push. Maybe you remember it as well. Do you remember they used to talk about the new man, right? Who, who does all of these kind of he helps out with the kids, he kind of shares the housework, and there was a push to do all of this sort of stuff in the 90s, and I remember it. And there was a lot of depictions of like bad old 80s men who were just demanding their meal on the table, and they were like, things are changing, you have to be more equitable with the distribution of tasks and all this sort of stuff. And I just find it remarkable that it's taken like less than, when was that? Like, when was the 90s? 20 years ago?
30 years ago now, I would say.
Oh God, so old. Yeah, I mean,
don't do that kind of math. It's traumatizing for all of us.
But it's taken that amount of time for people to unironically be LARPing as trads online, trying to sell this shit as traditionalism. It's just like, what are you talking about? I mean, this is like, I just can't think of any tradition that embodied this idea that
I don't think the Aryan nobleman would have had that role in his household. But again, it is this inversion of the sexes that comes in modernity. That push came around the time when women were very aggressively being pushed into the workforce, told to have careers. That was kind of the beginning of raising girls to think that they need to have a career, and that being a mother is something shameful or worthless. Mm-hmm. So you're pushing women into the workplace at the same time you're trying to get men to do domestic chores. How's that worked out for you? Now I've got, I'm all for involved fathers. I do think fathers should be involved and cultivate good relationships with their kids rather than just being the guy who goes to work and only comes home for dinner while he reads the paper. That's not traditional either. That's a remnant from a degenerated 1950s, which has nothing to do with being traditional, because that's not a natural relationship to the family either. So I would encourage, fathers or men who would like to be fathers to read that chapter in Revolt about the patriciate, or watch my episode on it, and really consider, what does it mean to be a man in the role of husband and father as a head of a household? What are your spiritual duties and obligations in that role? What kind of work must you do on yourself to truly be worthy of calling yourself a man? Because the tasks that we do in our day-to-day lives are just tasks unless they are done with a connection to something inward.
I'm probably going to be returning to this theme in a few weeks. I think on the 15th, I'm going to have a guest on where we're going to talk about the idea of withdrawal and return, which is something that a lot of heroes did in the myths. They, like a lot of men, or a lot of heroic men, have gone away and then they've come back, right? And I weirdly think about this in relation to my own father, who was at sea a lot of the time when I was little. So he was always going away and then coming back again. So it was almost kind of like my dad wasn't always around, but that's just seemed normal to me. So this is something else I wonder about, though, when we talk about like what's traditional. I do wonder, like, well, were the men always there? Or like, I do have this idea that the man is always at home and he's always there in this domestic space is a relatively new idea. It's like a relatively modern thing. I just don't. There are long periods. I remember the passages in Shakespeare where the wife is literally pleading with this guy, like, "Don't go," and he's just like, "No, I have to go." Then he rides his horse and he's gone for like 3 years, and then he comes back again and things like that. So, I mean, this is just something that I think we have like strangely warped notions about family.
This is one of those ways in which women suck men in and then destroy them, because they are wanting certain whims gratified. Like maybe they want the company of their husband at home. They want him to help out with all of these domestic tasks. For whatever reason, they're feeling overwhelmed or isolated, and they just need more of him. And some of this is just a modern sickness because, women by and large are raising families without the support of their extended family or any friends around them. You know, parenting has become weaponized in that sense. And so young couples especially often find that they have only each other to lean on, and child rearing becomes very, very difficult and very draining. And so I can understand the impetus for that. But at the same time, my advice to women, if they are finding themselves, you know, in that dynamic where they are asking things of their husband or boyfriend that degrade his masculinity in some way, the job of the woman in that case is to really kind of step back and work on cultivating her own inner masculine to provide that sense of support for herself that she's looking externally for. And this is, I think, very difficult for most women to do, especially the more lunar they are, the more it feels like it's kind of going against their nature. But I do think that women have the capacity for some level of self-sufficiency. How much is going to vary from woman to woman, of course. But if if you're in a situation where your life circumstances are basically demanding that you emasculate your husband, something's got to change.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do think you raise a valid point there about support networks, which is something that I've talked about on the show before. My dad's family is from Iran, as a lot of people know, where they maintain much bigger family networks. And they have, I mean, I remember seeing my grandmother in action, and she had almost like a staff of almost 20 other people to help her. You know, it's just like a whole different thing to have, 3 aunts or sisters around or something like that versus the situation now where, in many cases, women don't have anybody to help them. And even if they have family up the road, they're too busy, or they're at work, or there's always some reason that they can't. I mean, this is just the reality of living in modernity, I suppose. Anyway, shall we hit some? Before we hit the super chats, any final words on the solar masculine and lunar feminine, Kat? What can people take away from this?
What can people take away from this? Well, I think the first thing is, from a practical standpoint, be honest with yourself about what type of race of spirit you have and whether or not you're living in alignment with that. If you do feel like you want to be more solar, if that's what your soul is calling you to do, I would really encourage you to look into some of these readings and contemplate it. Especially for men, I think this is very important, because in the Kali Yuga, the feminine is running the show and the masculine is asleep. There's no shortage of opportunities for women to act like women or men, but there's not a lot of room for men to figure out what it means to be a man and how to put that in practice. And if you don't have anybody in your life who can model that for you, then you're best to turn to old books and read from people who can explain it or who modeled it themselves.
Well, what if let's just pretend I figure out, right, I'm just lunar. I'm lunar feminine me. What do I do? Can I just transition, or what? What's the advice if somebody's listening and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a lunar person?
Do you actually think that you're a lunar person?
No, I'm just saying hypothetically.
Well, the question is whether or not you feel comfortable being a lunar person, or whether you feel like you could be more. People
Right.
who are happy being lunar probably aren't even watching the stream or asking that question. But if you recognize in yourself a lot of lunar qualities, but feel that had you been born in another time and place, you would be solar, then that's a sign that you need to start cultivating these virtues within yourself and developing that within yourself, so that you can be one of the people that Evola calls one of the men among the ruins. Mm-hmm. Those are the people who will usher in the next golden age. You know, it's not going to be just like, oh, we all die out and then suddenly a new golden age just magically appears, all populated with brand new people. There will be people who retained that solar quality through the worst of what the material world can throw at them, did not let it affect them, and because of that inner heroism are then qualified to seed the next golden age. So that's, I think, what we should all be striving for if we feel so called.
Yeah, when you were describing the moon-faced people before, I couldn't help but think of, like, you know, like in Harry Potter, there's that house Hufflepuff. You know, like kind of there are Hufflepuff people that you meet, like in real life, and they're all a bit kind of. Do you remember like Trigglypuff, that angry?
Yes.
That was a kind of figure I'm picturing. But anyway, a few super chats then. Pronomian Chomsky says, "AA, you said last stream that you believe Evola was in hiding in Vienna. Gianfranco de Turris, in his book Evola, the Philosopher and Magician in War, speculates Evola was working for the German S." I actually got that line about him being in hiding in Vienna from that book. So the Turris was my actual source. I don't know if you've read that book, Kat, but that book has forensic detail in it. There's a moment in that book where Evola goes to like welcome Mussolini in Salo, and like Hitler may have been there and all this sort of stuff. And there's this little detail where it says, "Oh, they were given a box of cigars," and this guy's like, "Yeah, if you're wondering, this is the exact make. Here is the number on the box. You go and look it up." It's just, I've never seen so much detail in a. He only covers like 2 years of Evola's life, but it's in like ridiculous high detail.
Interesting.
Pronomian Chomsky says German SD researching Freemasonry in Vienna. Does philosopher Cat, I can never say it. I'm just going to call you Cat. Does Cat have an opinion on why Evola might have been in Vienna at the end of the war?
I want to say that there's a book that might cover that, which I have on my shelf and haven't had a chance to read yet, and the name of it escapes me. So once I read that book, I might be able to answer that question. But in terms of like the biographical details of his life, it's not something I've been ever super interested in, partly because he didn't consider it important either, and there's just not a lot there.
Yiz the Eunuch says, "I can't stay for the whole stream since my weekly stream is tonight. Sorry for sniping, Yiz, but I had to change my regular time. I'm glad to see Kat.
Yiz.
I'm glad to see Kat on here again. She's one of the few great female minds in our sphere."
Thank you, Yiz.
Pronomian Chomsky says, "Is the West the only civilization to develop a linear, progressive understanding of time? And if so, why?" To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question, but I guess that the other Abrahamic religions also have a linear version of time.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I wouldn't say it's exclusive to the West, but it is a relatively modern phenomenon in any case.
Coney says, if the lunar is more feminine, does that mean that Islam is a more feminine religion than Christianity because it uses a lunar calendar system as opposed to the solar calendar that Christianity uses?
I mean, I'd have to sit there and kind of tally up all the various solar and lunar qualities of both religions, and Islam isn't one that I've studied in like great depth, so I hesitate to issue a pronouncement on that. I think it's definitely indicative of the fact that it is a lunar religion, but I wouldn't say that that's the only qualifier, I don't know how heavily I would necessarily weight that compared to other things. I'd really have to like sit down and look into it more.
Evola does praise Islam when he's discussing jihad, doesn't he? And I think there's a book called The Metaphysics of War
Yes, and he also has the chapter in Revolt on the greater and lesser holy war, which draws heavily from Islam. And, that's probably one of the redeeming features of Islam. But, just because a religion has some traditional elements doesn't mean it's traditional as a whole, or that it provides a pathway back to the world of tradition. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind.
I'll just say as an aside, I've actually been writing the conclusion of Prophets of Doom today. And one of the common elements in basically all of the cyclical theorists that I cover in the book is the contrast between the very early, what I call the spark that sets off a civilization, which is often raiders on horseback. Like in the case of Islam, it's literally Muhammad and his original riders who come and they conquer most of the Middle East in about 20 years. There's often a contrast between that, which I call the spark, and the religion that develops later in the empire phase. So I'm thinking about like the Umayyad Caliphate when it comes to Islam, which I call the imperial altar. I guess you could call it universal church or something like that. That second, I guess Evola would call it an exoteric religion versus the kind of whatever it was that was driving those original like warriors. This is something I've been thinking about a great deal today as I've been writing this conclusion, because I'm not convinced that they're the same. Everybody thinks, oh, well, religion, right? But it's clear to me that, and you see it all over history, right? It's not just Muhammad. It's like you see it in the in some of the Crusaders, for example. The followers of Charlemagne. Some of you see it in the early conquests of Alexander, Cyrus the Great. Like you get at the start of every civilization, you get this like great man who comes, usually on horseback, usually with conquest, and usually with some kind of like fanatical zeal, which looks something like jihad or something like that. But that spirit very quickly dissipates when the territories that they conquer has to be administered, right? And that is when you start getting the priest types and the intellectuals and all of these sorts of characters come along. And my buddy Mike from Imperium Press calls them the Odinic type versus the Toric type, right? And it's when the Toric men come along that you get the codification of whatever that energy was into an exoteric religion for the plebs, if that makes any sense. So that is something that I think that a lot of the other I think Evola would agree with that. And I think that there's I don't know. I mean, I'm never comfortable just saying like, well, that's Islam. Well, was what Muhammad was doing Islam? Like you say, like in theory, you'd say yes, but or like was what Jesus was doing, like Christianity.
Yeah,
it seems to me like bear no resemblance. Do you know what I'm saying? That there's the initial burst of something is not the same as the thing that comes to manifest in a kind of Toynbee calls it the ephemeral institution, right? It's a kind of, because that's just of this world. It's just a kind of, it comes to a matter of like organization.
Yes,
like going to church, like
becomes very institutionalized.
Right, yeah. Have you got the right badges? Have you signed up to tea after church or whatever it happens to be, right? I mean,
yeah. How good of a dogmatic rule follower are you?
All right. Coney says, I am listening to the stream on a sofa in front of a wood-burning stove, wearing a dressing gown under a blanket with a glass of Courvoisier cognac in a brandy glass. Get on my cozy maxing skills. So there we go.
Sounds like he's having a good time.
Then over on the other super chats, we have Sadie Labounty says, as a political strategy, could we adopt a higher form of feminism as the return to the Silver Age? It would surely be better than the Iron Age.
Well, I mean, it's better only temporarily. The same process of degradation would still occur. But there are certainly ways in which you could promote a healthier feminine. I mean, for example, like the Atlantean Silver Age conception of the feminine that wasn't the sanitized mother, but was the supernatural virgin. I mean, that's a very kind of Apollonian conception of the feminine. It's not necessarily like something to do related to sex and generation or motherhood. Excuse my cat's butt. I'm sorry.
Is your cat lunar or solar?
He's pretty lunar.
Qwerty says, is Jesus the Kwisatz Haderach? I don't even know what that question means.
I don't either.
Raging Mandrill says, the spirit Evola is referring to is a junior partner under Christianity. The West is spiritually bipolar. Need to flip the script to reverse course. What does he mean by junior partner in that? Do you have any idea?
What is the word?
He says the spirit Evola is referring to is a junior partner under Christianity.
A junior partner.
I guess he's talking about the solar energy, right?
Yeah, maybe if that's what he's talking about, then I guess I wouldn't disagree with that necessarily, but I might need more clarification.
So I didn't see how. If his description of the Silver Age basically seems to give no scope for there to be a kind of co-location of solar energy, because he basically says that men are. I mean, at one point he talks about their weapons being broken by like butch Amazon women. I mean, am I making this? This happens, right? The Amazon warrior women basically break their battle. They steal the battle axe and break it. And
well, I mean, the battle axe and the sword, those kind of weapons are symbolic of masculinity, the masculine principle. So the fact that those are specifically the types of weapons that they're breaking in myth is indicative of the destruction of masculine virility.
I mean, it says, let me see if I can find the actual place in that chapter, but I mean, he basically says that everything that's masculine is mocked and seen as low, and there's no place for it, basically, in the complete Silver Age, right? So I guess my real question is, how can the two things exist side by side? It seems like when the Silver Age comes along, it's all encompassing. It kind of like completely destroys the solar or devours it.
I mean, it's a process of degradation, but the fact that like certain solar things still survive to this day so far into the Kali Yuga, I mean, it's not like a switch is just flipped and then suddenly everything's inverted. That process is going to take a long time, and Evola is also accounting for the fact that you had these other foreign elements coming up from the remnants of Lemuria in the south and contaminating this. And, this is part of what he tries to do with his work, is sort of like tease apart which elements of a myth or culture or tradition belong to the North versus the South.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we didn't get onto it, but don't a bunch of barbarians come along and basically kill them all at some point in the Silver Age, like to trigger the Bronze Age? Is that not?
Oh, I can't remember. Maybe.
I mean, I think, but he says that they're not. It's not the return of like Golden Age regality. They're just kind of merely brutes. He says somewhere later on.
Well, that's the Amazonian man. I mean, all he has left to him is brute force. He has no other power left. That's our Andrew Tate masculinity.
Sadie Labanti says, the primordial state is beyond solar and lunar. Raging Mandrill says, praise the sun. Sadie the Bounty says, Evola said to avoid female-mediated spirituality. Sadie the Bounty says, last week's UO mentioned feminist literature reclaiming negative archetypes. There is an interesting book on this called Satanic Feminism, Lucifer as the Liberator of Women in 19th Century Culture. Yeah, they want to reclaim Lilith, and I mean, there's a lot, witches, you name it. They try to reclaim it in feminism. Spank McGee says, I'd like to join an ancient solar cult if it could teach me to be a solar man.
Wouldn't we all?
But none exist, Kat. That was the problem that Evola found himself, right? Famously.
Yeah, it's true.
Sam 153 says, stream appreciation. Well, thank you very much, Sam 153. It means so much. Terry Tate says, Morcar DS2 run when? Well, maybe. Now my book is finished. Maybe I've got more time to mess around because I've been at it for months now. Marco Polo says, what would Evola make of homosexuals and the even weirder stuff we are seeing now?
What would Evola make of homosexuals?
Yes. And the even weirder kind of, the tranny stuff and so on and so forth.
I actually did a stream about that with Evelyn, who I think's been on your channel a few times, on hers in regards to the topic of the third sex, which is one of the essays in the Bow and the Club, where Evola discusses that. But he also has a whole, section in Eros on homosexuality as well. So I would encourage that commenter to start with those.
I mean, I would say that.
But he's negative against it.
Yeah. I would say, though, Kat, that generally it's fair to say that Evola doesn't have time for what he describes as kind of petty bourgeois moralizing, right? Correct. He is not. Everybody thinks, oh well, trad. That means this guy's going to have like. He's not a moralizer in that way. He's
not trad in that sense at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, he doesn't have any use for these petty bourgeois morals. He when it comes to things like deviant forms of sexuality, I think what he'd probably say is, well, it's the Kali Yuga. What do you expect? I told you this was coming. I don't think he would be the kind of person who'd sit there and be like, oh my gosh, look at that. Did you see what that person's doing? Can you believe how things are going? It's like, no, he knew how things were going to go. He laid it out. His predictions on that were fairly good. And he was already seeing the seeds of that in his own day, and even tracing back further than that in many cases. So his view on homosexuality is that it's, deviant, but it's a sign of the polarity of man and woman kind of merging closer and closer together, so that there's less and less difference between them and less room for that fluid of eros to move.
It's weird though, because we are seeing that, literally, women are becoming more manly and men are becoming more girly. I don't know if you've seen a youths recently, Cap. It's actually my wife has started to say, have you noticed young men are really girly now? Yeah, they are. It's kind of strange. But also on the other hand, girls are starting to become a lot more masculine.
That's going to happen when you because we're in an age where the masculine principle is asleep. Men are cut off from their own innate nature in some ways. This leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum is then filled by women who are like, well, he's not doing what he needs to as a man, and they may not consciously know what that function is, and they try to step into it themselves because it's not getting done. And women, being material creatures, are very practical. So you'll have if you've got a woman who's she's got a career and an income, and her husband earns less than her and sits around playing video games all day, well, she's going to become kind of a tyrant in the house. And she's going to start treating him like a child because from her perspective, he's failing as a man. She can't respect him. She can't respect him as a man. And in a relationship that's romantic, she can't respect him. So you get these Amazonian feminists and these, metaphysically castrated men. And what do you expect would happen in that case?
Yeah, absolutely. Guillaume de Mercier says, I've come to understand the distinction between profane truth and supertruth. Sublunar elites still seem to possess the myth-making power of supertruth. Okay. King Cribble says, these streams improve my life. I'm still poor, though. Well, thank you very much, even if it was just $2 Australian, which is probably like 10 pence or something. Thank you, King Cribble. It still means so much. Why is Evola not taught in any school?
Well, I think that's because it would challenge the narrative that the powers that be would like to impose on us.
Yeah.
In so many ways, where to begin?
Yeah, you'd be problematic. I mean, that book, that Synthesis on the Doctrine of Race, for one, would be problematic in any modern context. Right?
Well, it's only problematic because we're supposed to deny race. And Evola is problematic because we're supposed to deny, the cyclical nature of time. We're supposed to accept evolution and progressivism and equality. And, what he's promoting is a worldview that's very, very different from that. So different to the point that many modern people, even when they're conservatively inclined, still cannot wrap their head around it because they can't get past the modern liberal paradigm shift, just like Jordan Peterson can't get past it.
Alice Liddell says, formerly Sabine Wren, says, the Norse had the sun was female and the moon was male.
Yeah, that's also in the Nordic Germanic parts of the world. That's actually very common. Evola says, and I agree, that that's indicative of a lunar civilization, an attributing of the solar light to the feminine as the life-giving principle. So it's, even though I'm of that race myself, I have to say they were wrong.
It's strange, though, isn't it? Because doesn't he say that the solar people come from the north and the lunar people come from the south, right? So,
Yeah. So what he says in Synthesis, he goes into this more in detail, but also in the second half of Revolt, where he's kind of outlining, the historicity of all of this. So he outlines 3 waves of migration out of Hyperborea, many that overlapped with other waves of migration from Hyperborea or even other places. So you've got the first wave down into India, Persia, where those people have retained the best form of Hyperborean spirituality, the least degenerated. You then had the east-west migration, which was populating the Mediterranean through Atlantis, but he posits that Atlantis would have already been established as a colony anyway. So you would have had a lot of cross migration going on across Europe. And then, finally, the north to south migration, which would have been the very last people to leave as the climate becomes more and more hostile. So they're the most phenotypically pure looking, but they're also the most degraded in spirit. And he points to, as evidence for that, the fact that the Nordics and Germanics, despite, having that classic like Aryan look, are the quickest to adopt the most lunar things like communism and feminism and just whatever crap gets fed to them, they just seem to lap it up. And he says that that's because they lack their inner race. Interesting.
Remoralization says, any thoughts on Crowley and more Promethean ideas?
I haven't really studied Crowley. I've not really ever been drawn to him. But, Prometheanism is something that's that's the Titanic nature. It's wanting to steal something that you don't have the right to. And it was considered a great crime to impart, the secrets of Aryan initiation to somebody who was not qualified for it. So the stealing of fire from the gods by somebody who couldn't generate it himself, I think in the context of this discussion is, certainly very interesting to consider.
Evola says, what happens after the Kali Yuga?
Well, probably another golden age, and that it will be seated by those of us who remain standing amidst the ruins. So the golden age will have to be kickstarted by the heroic action of those who are able to stand firm against the Kali Yuga.
Cruelty says, in Dune, Paul Atreides becomes a fusion of masculine and feminine. I was just wondering if Jesus represents a similar symbolic form.
I don't know enough about the characters in Dune to know what he's really referring to there, so I can't really answer that. I don't know if you know Dune better than I do.
No, I don't, I'm afraid. No.
I keep meaning to read it, though, so ask me again in a couple of years and I might have gotten around to it.
He does, when he talks about it, he does talk about the cult of the Mother, Virgin Mary, as somehow like taking over Christianity at a certain point in history, doesn't he?
Yeah, it is really interesting, the kind of almost obsession with the Marian cult. And it is very lunar, and it's always populated with these images of the mother holding the Christ child. The solar principle emanates from her. She's the life giver of the Christ principle. And the level to which Catholics in particular devote attention to Mary is really interesting. And definitely, I think, speaks of some of that southern contamination that you're referring to.
Coney says the Yuga cycles could make a great theme for world building, a sci-fi setting or universe, or the majority of Hindu cosmology for that matter. Has there ever been like a film of like the Hindu gods, or do they not do that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm probably the last person you should ask about film and television, because I watch almost none of it and I have no idea what's going on.
Well, I think we've got to the end of the super chats there. I'm after this stream, I'm going to go off to fulfill my destiny as a druidic Zoroastrian fire mage. And I'm not going to stop my training, Kat, until I can do fireballs at will. I want to master the ability to shoot fire, but maybe I'll never get there. So, last minute super chat. Sadie LeBounty says, if anyone finds speaking of distant ideals like Atlantis absurd, they should consider the way that modern evolutionism is projected into prehistory. And also, Museo Scarola says, was Napoleon a late example of a solar man?
Just based on his physiognomy, I would probably say unlikely, but I don't know enough about his biography or him as a person to really weigh in too much on that.
I seem to remember that Evola discusses Bonapartism in, is it Man Among the Ruins? I feel like there's a chapter on Bonapartism in there.
There is a chapter somewhere, and I'm not entirely remembering which book it was.
He's not that up for Napoleon. Surprise, surprise. Neither was Carlyle.
I wouldn't imagine so. No.
Yeah. So, Kat, if people want to find your stuff, where should they go? What have you got coming up, etc.?
Well, they should go subscribe on my YouTube channel, which is probably linked in the description, or just search it up how it's spelled on the screen. There should be more content coming, hopefully soonish. I have a few things in the pipeline in that regard. Astrology readings, as always, at astrologicat.com. Again, you can find those links on my videos. You can follow me on Telegram, and we will probably also be starting up the astrology study groups in February again.
Another last minute super chat. Washability says, I was given an excerpt from Carlyle's model prisons to compare with other excerpts relating to prisons in English around 5 years ago. Well, based English department there. I would just like to say, please remember 25% off all my courses at the moment until the end of January. Promo code SureJan.
Sure.
Sure, Jan.
Can you? And I'll be back. I'll be back tomorrow night with Unpopular Opinions, where I think I've got on Cows and Mark as a brand new partnership. I'm going to be trying to bring the solar energy in an all lunar panel. but Kat, thank you so much. It was interesting discussion, and hope to speak again.
Yes, thank you. It was a good chat. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks a lot, Kat. Now get out, everybody. Where's my
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.